Hello to those out there in the Zoom land. We'll get started here in a minute. We just have two of our members right now, so we're waiting for a couple more folks to show up, and then we'll get going.
Am I seeing everybody when I see 4 people here?
No, there's, that's why I put it on my phone, there's, others on the participants list.
Am I right that like individual people here cannot be on the screen?
This is just a display for you.
2:45 meeting?
2:45.
2:45.
Yeah, come on in.
A couple of them are late.
What's that?
Are you holding the meeting for?
Exactly, yeah, now that
two
you're
of us?
here, now that you're here, we can start.
Yeah, now that you're here, we can start.
We've got a couple members.
Minimum requirement of 2 in the. Some people have run out of gas. Agenda here. People are zooming.
Kind of the reason we did this.
It's Christmas. Jingle bells, jingle bells.
So Brandon, with your timing focus, you must have all your Christmas shopping done.
Oh, I'm terrible at that. I just finished yesterday. Yeah, it's not right.
How many Zoomers have checked in?
I've got 6 on there right now.
I guess you're gonna get tired of hearing me speak, huh?
No, never. People, I want people to speak. I wish more people would speak. I appreciate you taking the time to write, the emails that you write. They're clearly thoughtfully constructed.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, that was terrific.
There you go. And I can't. Is the red light on?
Oh, there it is.
There
Now
you
I
go.
see the red. Okay. All right, welcome everybody. We are not all here, but we have a quorum, 3 out of 5, Dawn, myself, and Melanie. So that I'm calling the meeting to order. We will be joined by Marian shortly, it sounds like. So first, let's just, while she's not here, and then we can fill her in later, let's take public comments on non-agenda items if there are any. Here, Neil.
I'm Neil Cruz. I just want to thank you guys. What you're doing takes a lot of time and a lot of work, but I think that we at the CPA feel that we can be heard and we have a point of communication. I want to thank you for being there for the public.
Thank you, Neil. I don't, and you're anyone from the Zoom room? I see Nancy Toomey is on video. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, just real quick, happy holidays to everybody, and thank you as well.
Thank you, Nancy. Anyone else from the Zoom have their hand? I don't see any hands up or any mics on. Wait, I see Shirley's mic is on. Did you want to say something, Shirley?
Yes, pardon me. I just had one quick comment, and I can't remember, Victoria, where you were showing the landscape rendering, how important it was from the streetscape, looking back at the architecture, how the landscape was so important to retain the forest view. But one thing I wanted to see is if we could get a more realistic rendering where we have the power lines that will impede that type of forest in front of our homes. If you look up and down the street, you'll see where the power lines have caused those beautiful tall trees to be butchered. And so it's not quite as lovely as your rendering showed, and I think we should be realistic about it and show the power lines in that grid so that we can understand the type of canopy trees we can plant. Thank you.
Thank you, Shirley. Power lines is a topic that we haven't really brought up much, so I'm going to put a pin in that. Any other comments from the public in the Zoom room? Because I don't see any comments here. Hi, Marian is joining us. Okay, no mics are on. So I'm going to, for now, close that part of the meeting. That was agenda item 2, and we're going to go to announcements. Dawn, do you have any announcements? Okay. Marianne, welcome. Do you have any announcements? How about you, Melanie? Any announcements? No? How about you, Brandon?
Nope.
No
I'm
announcements?
excited to get to Nori's presentation.
Okay, I know. I have one announcement, and that is, peace on earth, goodwill to us all. I think the avenue to getting there is a fantastic, accessible set of design guidelines, at least for this community. And I just want to remind folks, and we did take some steps, I think good steps last 2 meetings toward making them more accessible and thinking about how to make them pithy and friendly. And I want to let folks know or remind them that we still have this resource web page called steeringcommittee.universe. And what the draft notes from that are just for those 6 principles we came up with are there now in their draft form. So steeringcommittee.universe with a dot between the univer and the s.
I'm having a little trouble hearing it.
Really? It's maybe the mask?
Yeah, the mask.
We are really, it's unfortunate that it's harder that way.
No.
Anyway, just a reminder to go to the resource page for the steering committee. It's called www.steeringcommittee.universe.
Steeringcommittee.universal?
Universe,
Universe.
Yeah.
Steeringcommittee.universe.
right, except it goes univer.se. There's another dot.
Okay.
So I can send it. You just contact me, I'll send it to you. Okay. That's my announcement. Let's move on to this presentation that we're very grateful Nori was able to squeeze in, Nori and the staff, to explain to us what the heck these tools are of bulk plane models.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Nori, while you get your screen pulled up there, I'm going to just do a quick little intro here. So on the dais, also for the public at the table there, Nori put together some initial questions for considering a bulk plane in the residential and in the downtown areas. So what we're here today for is for Nori to give you a more in-depth presentation on what a bulk plane tool might look like, what it is, and then to have this high-level conversation, bearing in mind that, you know, if we continue down the road of including a bulk plane tool in the new guidelines, there will be a point where we'll be looking at them in the guidelines and take a more in-depth look at how they apply and cutting up the language. So, you know, I would beg your indulgence in keeping the conversation sort of at that level. Like, let's keep it at the conceptual level of the bulk plane. If you have any questions about what it is or how it works, or using these questions here to kind of guide us through the conversation, that would be the ideal outcome today, because we do only have about, well, we only have Mary Ann for a little bit of time, and then we're going to be wrapping up about 4:30 today. So with that, I'll hand it over to Nori to dazzle us with his bulk plane presentation.
How long do we have you, Mary Ann?
Dazzle isn't perhaps the the right term, but good afternoon. And I'm sorry, I still have my residual cough, so there may be a moment where I go silent for a second if I have a coughing fit. But as Brandon introduced, this is an overview of what bulk plane tools are. We are not at a stage of proposing anything for Carmel, and the examples shown are not of Carmel. And I just wanted to make that clear from the very outset. This is an educational session to help explain what the tool is, and then based on the questions that might get generated today, we will start seriously considering it and discussing it with staff next month after the holidays. So I wanted to mention that, and also that in addition to some of the ideas showing up in the guidelines, it is if a bulk plane is to be implemented, it really is a zoning code change, and the objective there is that potentially it would replace the volumetric measure that is currently in use, or at least it's not as though they're a one-to-one exchange necessarily, but that it would allow the removal of that particular tool. Other terms that it's known as are just a buildable envelope or an encroachment plane. And the illustration here shows the concept of one kind of a bulk plane. The blue envelope is the area within which a building may be built, but it is not the maximum size of the building. A building can be moved around it. In this particular case, this illustration shows the maximum house size that is buildable in this particular context. It can be moved around in different locations or reconfigured into different forms and styles, but that is the idea of a bulk plane envelope. And so I'll go through some examples of that. Along the way, I do want to refer back to some of the feedback that we've gotten in the workshops that may lead a direction toward an approach to a bulk plane. So what we want to do today is to help sort of broaden the understanding of what the tool is and how it works. And then I have generated those initial questions, but I also expect that there will be many other questions that will be raised. And there are two different kinds of application. One is for the R1 residential districts. And that's where the initial part of the presentation will focus, is on a single family residential context and how it might apply there. And then after we discuss that, we'll talk a little bit about downtown, where there are a variety of zone districts, and how a bulk plane, what we would want to explore if we were to look at it there. One of the things to maybe look at is from the workbooks that came out of the last workshop. And if you recall, a variety of buildings were presented for people to comment on in terms of whether they felt it fit with the village character. And it's very risky to try to rate or tabulate these. So I do this only as an indication of general trends. What we were looking at is what were people responding to? What were they seeing? What were they considering of value, and looking at some of the house designs that were presented. These are the top 5 that, when you kind of aggregated people's responses to those that felt that it fit, that rose to the top. If you recall, people could comment on whether something fit, basically entirely, or fit somewhat, or did not fit. And a large number of those responding liked what was building number 2 on the upper left. And then that was 33 respondents. You'll see the number of respondents liking or saying that the others fit, if you will. Not that they liked it, it's probably not fair, but that they felt it fit. There are a variety of styles, from a Bay Area contemporary in the upper left to a variety of those that are more traditional cottages, and even some that reflect some of the historic styles. What is interesting is they all seem to have at least some type of a one-story element in front, as well as some varied massing, if you will. In that category of fits somewhat, there were these buildings, and some of them are repeats from the previous one, but others were ones that, in this case, generally there was a mix of people that thought they fit, or those that didn't fit, or they felt parts of the image fit, but others didn't. So in some cases, it was the landscape that was an issue, and maybe not as strong a fit as some of the others might be. On the other hand, image number 9, where there were 15 respondents, one of the reasons it scored well was because of the landscape in front, the filtering, if you will. So it's just something to keep in mind as we think about a building envelope, how massing and form and scale at the street edge might relate, but also, although the landscape isn't technically affected by a building envelope, the forms behind it and how that relates to the landscape is worth thinking about. So what do we have today? We have what I would call a de facto bulk plane, and that is you could draw an envelope that's implied by simply the height limit and the minimum setback requirements that the city has in the R1 and other residential districts right now, and the maximum FAR. Now, the FAR here gets really tricky because of the incentives and the bonuses given if you go partially underground. But if you were just to build on top, this is roughly the biggest house you could build with the current FAR limitations. And
could you just describe FAR? I'm sorry to interrupt.
And that's just, and the idea is that there is a ratio of the building size, the amount of square footage to the lot size, and that is the floor area ratio. And you can see here again that the form, and there's so many different design options, but the form could move around within that. Parts of it could step down, it could pop out into a variety of ways. The other part of the current code is the volumetric measurement, which literally limits the volume of a building, in addition to the floor area ratio and the above ground and below ground bonuses. And in the code, there actually are some different maximums for buildings with sloped roofs versus flat roofs, but there is a feeling that the current building envelope, volumetric measure, tends to encourage flat roofs, and it makes it difficult to do steeply pitched roofs that might be more in keeping with some architectural designs. Now, what is it? I've already sort of defined it, but here's kind of a formal bulk plane definition. It is a series of horizontal and vertical planes which, when applied in 3 dimensions, sets the boundaries of the space a building may occupy. And again, it does not imply the maximum building size. Now, this particular example is a two-step form for a neighborhood in which there's a tradition of having two-story buildings in front with one-story additions or garages to the rear. And it sets those forms in part with the objective here of maintaining a lower scale and more light and air in the rear yards. That's not, of course, necessarily the concern in Carmel, but it's an example of how you would define the form. Going back to one of the surveys that maybe gives a clue as to why an envelope or bulk plane might be useful is that there was a question that asked about new houses. It said a new house can fit in regardless of style if it is subdued in its character, including size, form, materials, color, etc. So size being the part and form, perhaps to some extent that could relate to a bulk plane. And so a substantial number of people strongly agreed or somewhat agreed with that statement. About a third disagreed, but 2/3 essentially were saying, yes, a new house can fit in regardless of style. And just wanted to keep that in mind as we look at building envelopes. Now, the idea is to use it in concert with building size limits. Again, possibly a floor area ratio or just simply a maximum square footage size, but generally speaking, it's a floor area ratio that's used for that. And so in these sketches, all three of these houses have the same amount of square footage. It demonstrates that a variety of design solutions are available if you're careful enough to be certain that the building envelope is larger than the maximum floor area permitted, or vice versa, that the floor area is less than what the maximum building envelope permits. So the calibration of these factors is an important consideration. This is another example from a different project with a slight progression in floor area ratios, but again, the intent here was to illustrate the variety of building forms within the limits of the other guidelines that were in place in that community that could be built. And so part of the consideration when you're looking at designing a building envelope is to think about the variety of roof forms and building variations in terms of massing that you want to be certain to accommodate, and then certainly what it is you want the bulk plane to prohibit. So in these cases, they have sloping sides, and we'll talk about that a little bit more specifically in a minute, and then they go up to a height limit that flattens out. So you can imagine if this size lot gets much wider, the overall height still caps out at a certain number. So the bulk plane sets the limits of the building height, an overall maximum building height. It can, as in this case, shift mass to the middle of the lot. So in this case, it's a 3-story building, but the upper floors cannot encroach immediately on a neighbor. They have to move inward away from abutting properties in the interest of light and air, privacy, preventing looming scale, or whatever the objectives might be. That's what this form is doing. But again, it's not dictating the actual design other than the overall limits of massing. But you can imagine someone could here, within that, do simply a 2-story building that doesn't step up as high or set back as much in the middle and still be within that form. Now, there often, though, are encroachments that are permitted. And so typical ones are dormers or certain kinds of porches or balconies, certainly solar panels, and even chimneys, other kinds of projections that don't really impact overall mass and scale and may in fact help enhance variety along street. Here are some other examples of illustrations of how some encroachments are illustrated for a set of standards dealing with a sloping residential context. So what are the actual measurables that might be defined in a bulk plane? One is the number of envelopes. Are we talking about one, or is there a combination, such as in this situation, of two, where there's a front zone and there's a definition of how that is established, generally a measurable length from the front property line back to a certain point, after which then this lower form kicks in. There also are flip side versions of that where there's a lower form in front. The other measurables are the maximum height overall, and again here this building envelope caps out and is flat on top. The angle of the slope, and this is often something that needs to be calculated on very narrow lots. Often that slope is steeper, but again, you calibrate it so that you know you're accommodating the number of floors that you want and in the locations that you think are appropriate. Another variable, though, is the maximum height at the outside edge. Often you may see that as the plate height of a wall, and that may be set at the setback lines, or it may be set at the property lines. There's some decisions about which ones make the most sense in some communities, and that then influences how you begin to set those numbers. You can also tailor it for solar access, and to be certain that a solar angle is available to the abutting property, and that may be a consideration in Carmel. You also can tailor it to step down to sensitive resources or sensitive sites, such as a landmark building that might be of a lower scale, and you want to be certain that there isn't looming that occurs over that property. This might apply more to the downtown area, but it could be a consideration in a residential district as well. You then can tailor it to sloping sites, which of course is pretty much the universal condition in Carmel. And so there are a variety of ways in which that is calibrated and then measured. And so this is an example of one in which there are 10-foot increments is the way the envelope is drawn. Others draw them simply as a continuous sloping envelope, and that would be something to think about. And these are just some other illustrations of how testing an envelope for different slopes might occur, and also illustrating how it might apply to oddly shaped lots. There are some locations in Carmel where there are fan-shaped lots. So it can be a simple rectangle, but it usually has sloped sides. 2 or more bulk planes can be combined. You may have some 1- and 2-story options. And that might depend upon what the desired maximum height is at the close to the front setback or to the front of the property, or again at the rear if opening up the back is an important consideration. So these are, again, just some different forms, again, from other projects, so they're not proposals for Carmel. But just to show you the way they can be drawn. Here's a single rectangle extending from the front setback to the rear setback to the side yard setbacks. It rises on the sides to that maximum wall plate height, and then slopes at an angle to move taller mass into the middle. Here again is an example of a two-step one where there's a lower form in front. In this case, calibrated to be about the same length as the historic or traditional houses, which were one story, with additional mass in the rear. Here's an inverse of that, where a larger mass is in front and a stepping down occurs in the rear, but again, sloping. The difference here, though, now is that there's also a slope part of the form in the front wall plane, which is intended in this case to keep a lower form in front, or else you move a taller building back farther from that plane in order to build it. And here's another example of something growing even taller, with the side walls being essentially 1.5 story envelope, and then moving up to a full 2-story in front. And again, another slight variation with that kind of a sloping form in front. The point being that as you think about what are the issues about massing and scale at the street edge and impact on neighbors and looming effects, you can begin to think about what kind of form you want to take as a starting point. So a typical process for developing a bulk plan is to do a little bit of reverse engineering, and that is to look at existing buildings that are examples of the range of form and scale that you want to be certain can be built, and that you want to perhaps even have the bulk plan encourage or at a minimum facilitate. Then to think about what combination of bulk plan forms might you use, whether it's the 1 and 2 step, but also whether there are differences in neighborhoods or contexts where different bulk planes might want to be applied. At the same time, we want to keep it as simple as possible and minimize the complexity of the system. So that's something to keep in mind there. After generating those ideas, then you want to test the alternative dimensions, those heights, the angles, and the lengths of those envelopes. And to illustrate, as you saw with some of these examples, then some building forms that could be dropped within that plane to see if it's achieving the desired results and allowing the range of diversity that you want. So lastly, in terms of residential, is to raise the question of, are there special conditions, and how would we relate to those? Do we need to define different ones, or do we just talk about how they might be applied or adjusted in some situations? You will know better than I, but these are some different kinds of settings that we would have to be thinking about. Certainly a great deal of the village is traditional gridded lots, generally most of them orienting east-west, and of course with the streets stepping down the hill. And there's a lot of that, but it does have the uphill and downhill considerations, and whether or not there's a difference there is something to ask. But there are some others that are slightly different. Certainly the lots immediately along scenic vary in length and depth quite a bit. And also just the way they approach the street edge. So can that be handled in a one-size-fits-all envelope or not is something to think about. There also are some areas where there are curving streets and or steeply sloping streets. And does that make a difference in the application of the envelope? Maybe, maybe not. And then there are some that are irregularly shaped, where these are particularly in some of the later annexations, where there are some fan shapes, even some what we would call flag lots, where there's a narrow strip of land that serves for a driveway to lead to a parcel that's basically behind other parcels. And then, of course, there are some that are single family. There are ones, but they're a little bit larger. And those down in the Mission are some examples of that, but also of the same kind of wedge-shaped lots that occurred. Can we make the same envelope work here or not would be a question to consider. So in terms of what do we want to think about at this stage, one is what are the key issues about massing that we even need to be addressing here? And do we think that one envelope could or should apply throughout the village? And if not, how would we look at determining what the differences are? Is it lot shape? Is it street form and slope? Is it something else? And then for at least the traditional gridded streets, what do we think intuitively should be that basic envelope, the form of the bulk plane? Should there be a lower portion in front for a short depth to assure that there's that traditional one-story scale along the street edge? Should it have sloping sides to move some of the mass to the interior of the site? And are there differences in that uphill and downhill condition that we need to take into account? And are there other considerations? So before we will have a downtown segment here, but I think it's probably good to stop at this point and turn it back over to you, Victoria, and see how you want to proceed with some questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Nori. I think that was extremely clear, great illustrations. However, a very difficult topic, I think, probably for a lot of people. So I do want to open it up to questions right away. Anybody from the room here that would like a clarification or just have a question or a comment at this point on Nori's presentation? Neil, do you want to?
I don't know a lot about this. I just looked on the internet recently and had a question. I saw one bulk plane system. They used the average of the spot grades at the front plane of the house to set the lower plane. Nuri, is this ever done, or is this of any advantage?
Of using averages,
For setting the base plane?
Well, I think we do want to analyze a variety of scales of things to see what looks appropriate. I think there are some dimensional limits already in the code and guidelines that are good starting points for wall plate heights and things like that to think about. The question of whether it's averaging or not is an interesting one, because the average isn't necessarily what we want. It may be the range of variety that's within a certain range that is appropriate. I think it's more about looking at that range that's available, and you can get into mathematics as to whether it's the median or the mean or the average. We've tended not to do averaging when we work on code standards for that reason, but I wouldn't rule it out.
I think that's easier. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
How about our other live attender? Do you have any questions? Okay. Okay. Anyone from the Zoom room? I can't see right yet, but soon I will be able to see who's here. Okay. Looks like David has his hand up. David, you want to go ahead?
Hi there. Thank you for the presentation. I just had a couple of questions. I guess it's really one question with both systems. Does the top of the plane follow the slope of the lot, or does it stay level?
It would slope normally.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And these bonuses for underground development, so you could do underground development or something and be able to get extra square footage or something?
That's in the current system, yes.
Okay. And has there been any presentation to you about why we would need to change our system?
Well, we've been receiving comments that the current system, A, is has been resulting in some properties that people feel are inappropriate and out of scale. And second, that it is difficult to administer. The volumetric measure requires a specialist to calculate the three-dimensional cubic feet of a property. And it may actually, because it's simpler, be encouraging people to do flat roof buildings. So those are some of the comments that we've heard.
Can you explain to me how this would encourage, how our current system encourages flat roofs? I don't quite understand that.
Might want
Is
to
it
go back
because
to that
they can
slide.
go all the
Nora.
way up anywhere they want within the plane?
Oh, you're not controlling, oh, okay.
I
There's a slide at the
can maybe
beginning.
explain that. So it's just much simpler to calculate rectangles for most people than any kind of complicated shapes or.
Isn't that what we're doing now, though? I thought we were doing rectangles.
No, we have a very complex formula at the moment.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
I see Gabriel has his hand up. Gabriel?
Hello, thanks for convening this. I guess my question for Nori is, would a switch to this bulk planing method away from the volumetric generally allow for, in the case of a multi-family development, even a small one, whether it's a duplex, triplex, or something a little bit denser, do you tend to see that this system results in greater potential for, say, a number of dwelling units on the same with the same floor area ratio or say buildable area based, compared to the volumetric method?
I don't know. I mean, in both cases, these are regulating size and not use. So the number of units or whatever the use is handled elsewhere in the zoning code. But not in these form standards. So
yeah, and that's fine. I guess my question is just in terms of it could just be a number of rooms in a large home potentially, but is there any effect from this methodology on say that how much livable space is allowable versus the volumetric method? Or just usable space, I suppose. It doesn't, whether it's residential or not.
Well, Gabe, this is Brandon. Nora, let me try to take a swing at that. So I think the short answer is no, because really this comes down to not how many rooms or anything like that. The square footage of a house, the floor area, the height, all that stuff still exists. So those measures don't go away. So whether there's a bulk plane or not doesn't change how big the house itself can be. What the bulk plane does is how that mass is thrown onto a site, whether it can be one giant lump like a big ugly potato, or if it has to be kind of like spread out nicely across the site to blend into the topography and the surrounding houses. So it doesn't really change the size or usability of the structure.
Okay, yeah, thank you for answering that. I just wanted to clarify whether this was a factor for that. Part of me still imagines that there might be some effect based on what that envelope shape ends up being based on typical multifamily housing shapes or the shapes that are generally most efficient. So I guess when it comes to applying different envelopes across the town of Carmel, it might be wise to consider which envelopes are in use in certain zoning areas that might indeed affect what maximum efficiency is available in that bulk.
And Nori has paused his presentation, having just given some residential examples. I think we're going to get to the commercial district, is what I heard him hint at. Yes, okay.
Okay, thank you.
Is there anyone else in the Zoom room? I don't see any hands up at the moment, but maybe if you have thought of something, you want to jump in. Otherwise, I see that Neil has his hand up again here in the room, so I'll take it back to the room here. Neil, you have another question?
Sorry for trying to get in two comments, but
It's okay.
Neil Cruz, and you guys, what helps me is that when I think of volumetrics that we have now, it's how much volume is in the house. How big is that balloon? That's what our volumetrics does now. The plane says, hey, don't poke out here, don't poke out here, don't poke. It's very different. One is talking about how much volume is inside the house. That keeps the house, the total mass of the house, limited to a certain size. It doesn't change how the house, Nuri was actually explaining this, that the planes have an additional benefit of controlling where the house expands, which you do not have with volumetrics, which gives us more control, which is what I like about it. I also like the fact that I don't have to pay somebody $1,000 or $1,500 to have a volumetric study done, although I could do it myself, but I don't do it. But I see some advantages in this. And so that's the difference, the size of the house as opposed to the planes that
I
it
think
can
that's a
violate.
very good description, Neil. So it's sort of from inside out almost versus outside in some ways is a way to think about it. Okay, so let me ask the group here, including Brandon, does anyone want to pause for questions and clarifications now, or do we want to, I don't want to lose Marianne, so Marianne, I could make an exception for you also, that would be another strategy, or should we move on to the commercial district? Brandon, you want to say something?
I go move on, but it's up to you guys.
Okay.
Maybe we just get pretty straight.
Brandon votes move on. Do you want to say anything before, just in case, Marianne? No? Okay to move on?
Yeah,
Are you okay to move on, Nori?
Yes, I think so.
Okay,
Let's see.
I am writing
There
down
we
a
go.
number of questions that probably apply to everything, so happy to see the other set of examples.
Downtown consists of 4 zone districts, which have different, to some extent, different kinds of building types that are permitted and or accommodated, if you will. So often we think of the central commercial district, of course, along Ocean and just the block off of those, but there are the other ones to consider, including those that have the multifamily building types that were referenced earlier. And I will say, sort of to clarify, maybe a question about the ultimate impact on square footage. The starting assumption is that the current square footage that's allowed is probably going to stay in place. It's how that is placed on the lot. Now, it is a good question of would it in some way inadvertently limit square footage that maybe isn't buildable or something or other. So we'll want to watch out for that. But right now, there's not a directive to reduce the actual amount of square footage. It's more how it's arranged. So moving into this, some of the things that we got direction on from earlier activities was the idea of scale at the street, the variety of building form or variation in massing, if you will, that people preferred. And in the initial workshop, there were a variety of illustrations showing a range of infill projects, new buildings, but these also could, of course, relate to additions to existing buildings. There was one that was a single lot infill, one, and then there were 2 that used 2 lots, one that had a portion of the building of 2 stories at the street, and another one that had only 1 story at the street, and then another one that addressed 3 lots. And so what we were trying to get a sense for was how comfortable are people with 2 stories at the street edge, and how comfortable are they with projects that might be occupying several lots, although there are limited cases probably where that would occur. But what would be some of the things that would be important to consider? And the general findings and results of those were, yeah, 2-story buildings fit, and even 2-story buildings at the street edge fit. There were some considerations, though, about how that was done. And so again, there was a question in a follow-up survey in which there were 331 responses, and a large number of people agreed strongly or somewhat that it can have some 2-story portions. perhaps if it's in some way designed to reflect traditional building sizes. So that's, again, a piece of information to keep in mind here. Some of the other comments on those sheets were, yeah, two-story buildings are okay at the street edge. They prefer variation, though, in height along a block, not a uniform line of 2 stories. And that in considering where you might have 2-story portions versus 1-story portions at the street edge, that considering what the abutting heights of buildings are is something important to consider. And that other methods to reduce perceived scale might be considered articulation techniques, variety in surface treatments, et cetera, help along the way in terms of reactions to building massing. There are examples of that in town where for larger buildings, there you will see some variation in building form, roof form, or wall planes, some slight offsets or distinctions of window patterns that begin to reflect, if you will, sort of smaller scale widths of buildings along the street. There are a variety of these that you can look at to see variety in wall planes and heights, if you will, and even some changes in roof form that might be cues for how, when a larger building is designed, it can fit in. Here you see some variety of 1- and 2-story elements at the street edge, and then stepping back to a full maximum building height in the back. And there are even examples of that when you look at some of the accommodations in multifamily building types, where there's that variety in form regardless of style, and in some cases stepping down in scale, or at least variation in wall planes that begin to break up the massing and a variety of design treatments. So some of the questions for downtown are a little bit different, because in this case, in most cases, you can build to the lot line, say in the commercial core, or in others, there is a specified setback. And so how a bulk plane form accommodates variety here is a little bit different. For example, you're probably not looking at one that steps down to the front, because we know that 2-story buildings at the street edge are okay. And so it may be more the interplay of how the guidelines interface with a very simple bulk plane form or massing form, maybe important considerations here. So that's some of the questions that we would want to think about. If you envision a rectangular form for, say, the commercial core, just what is it that the bulk plane needs to do and allow, versus how do we assure that there is the compatibility in terms of massing that people found to be acceptable. So those are some of the key questions about the downtown zone districts. There is an assumption here that at least something would be different for the multifamily zone as opposed to the commercial core. Some of the others, the same building envelope may work. So those are some of the things to think about if we are to consider a bulk plane for the downtown zone districts. I'll turn it back over to you, Victoria.
Thank you, Nori. Again, very clear. I'm going to just hold off on public questions. We did have a chance to check in a second ago because we are going to lose Marianne shortly. So it's going to be, no pressure, Marianne, but it's going to be the Marianne show for a few minutes. You have to at least tell us the thoughts that you have, having listened to this presentation. We can come back to you. You don't have to have it all figured out, but what are your initial reactions?
Yeah, I think we have discussed some of it earlier at some point. So when it comes to downtown, I really think that our restrictions that we have just from lot coverage, height restriction, and setbacks is enough. I don't really see the point of having any additional bulk plane to be established in downtown. We have a lot of very different examples, as this currently showed. And I think that I don't actually know how many buildings downtown are historic. That would be, I would actually love to see that, how many buildings we have on the register. Do you happen to know that, Brandon?
I don't know it off the top of my head, but it's information we could get pretty quickly.
Yeah, that would be nice to see. And I really do like the special consideration for being next to a historic building. So I think that that is really a good, a very good rule to look at. And I think it would also really incentivize actually putting houses on the register. If we know that if a house is on the register, the lot to either side will not will not impact your sun angles and all other things. So I think that's a fantastic incentive. And for people that buy lots that are then next to historic buildings, it is just a restriction like a large tree or other restrictions that exist. So I very much like that approach.
That reminds me of something you said the other day when we were talking about how could we incentivize people to not max out. You said there's no way to do it, but you just came up with a very nice way to do it, which is to encourage folks to get their own buildings on the historic register in order to protect their own solar access, et cetera. That's a good idea. We can talk, we can have other folks chime in, but please keep going, Marianne, if you have other.
No, and I mean, I think in terms of the bulk plane, it is very difficult. I think that is a very difficult issue. I think the stepping back and having just a percentage that can be second story versus first single story, I always like that the best. Because if we know that a story doesn't count until a certain height, so it would encourage steep roofs because that part of the roof wouldn't count to that 1/3 or 2/3 or whatever one would say should be on the second floor, right? So if we say we have our setback limitations, we have a height limitations, and then you say so much, if you have a 2-story, this percentage can be second story, done, you know. Keep it as simple as you possibly can.
Before we go to the rest of the group, Brandon, do you have anything you want to chime in with on this and just things that came up from Nori's presentation, thoughts about Marianne's incentivization scheme?
No, I think, Nori and I had the conversation about kind of keying off what Marianne was saying about the downtown being looked at differently with a bulk plane. Nori and I had that conversation too, that, it's more in the downtown area, it's more about the guidelines, telling us what a building should look like, saying things like variation in the front of the building versus what we would accomplish in the residential district with the bulk plane. So, maybe that's where we go, is that we don't do a bulk plane in the commercial district, or if we do, it's really just a big cube. And then the guidelines tell you within that cube what you can do. So I think Nori and I were tracking along with that too. Like, we can do it all over the entire city, but maybe if this, one of the recommendations that comes out of this from you all is that not necessary in the commercial district. Let's focus on the guidelines, like what we want the fronts of the buildings to look like, what we want that variation to do. So that might be something.
I think also if you don't do bulk plane or complicated volumetrics and you do it with just a percentage, we could consider, since people like the idea of steeper roofs in town, we could consider keeping the, not more than the 18 feet for a flat roof building, so to speak. But then people who do have a roof that's more than 45 and more, right? Because you don't want any of those kind of roofs. To give them an extra couple feet of height, I think that would be a fair exchange.
So like with the steep pitch, like a 10 and 12 or like a 9 and 12 pitch, then the top part of that essentially would be exempt from the height
Exactly,
limits or
yeah,
something like
exactly, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to ask this side of the room, Don, representing my left side of the room. What are your reactions so far to the questions? Go ahead. Thank you.
Understand the outcome. In fact, I'd love to see some illustration of a design that follows our present volumetrics, and what about it wouldn't be allowed under the bulk plane, because I'm saying, would that stifle design? I don't know. I don't want to get too far away from what we're discussing, but I wonder if Nori can say, what have communities, can you tell us some communities that have adopted the bulk plane thing and their experience? Or you might just say, what is the main problem that has emerged in those cities? I'd be curious to know.
Well, maybe, Nori, can I start and then you can finish, because I have part of that answer. You know, we talked about this, that the current volumetrics calculation, it's a mathematical equation.
Yeah.
And so ultimately there's a house that exists and a form that exists that gets you the most production, the most bang for your buck. And so we have started to see the reproduction of similar roof pitches and similar shapes, because that's how you maximize. I mean, we have really expensive houses, and so if you know that you can maximize your square footage, that's the way to do it. My thought and argument would be that a bulk plane, if we go that route, actually increases creativity, because you're giving a three-dimensional form. You can do whatever you want inside that form. We're not penalizing you for doing a specific shape that then you lose this mathematical equation. That's my take on the bulk plane. But Nori, back me up or tell me I'm being crazy or add to that if you want.
And I'd like to see Nori also, if I could.
Oh yeah, Sebastian, can you flip back over to
Thanks.
Nori's face, please?
Oh, you want me to stop sharing the screen?
Yeah.
Sure, yeah, go ahead, Nori.
How do I, let's see, stop
I
share?
think Sebastian can stop it for you. There you go.
Yeah.
You're good. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, no, I think that's a good description. I appreciate Don's question. The challenges of so many variables. The very first, well, there was an early slide where we did illustrate a maximum simple rectangular pitched roof building that's permitted currently under the current volumetrics. But of course, there are other guidelines that kick in about massing and variation and things like that that we did not apply to that one particular model, but we could do some. I do appreciate Marianne's point about simplicity, and we have approached it the way she's described, which is rather than having an envelope, just set a percentage of upper floor. We've used that more often in a downtown commercial context than in a residential context. But it would depend on how strongly we really wanted to promote a one-story form in front. The idea of the envelope is that I could do just a simple two-story building, but it would have to move back potentially a little bit farther from the street than what a one-story building would do, and that's what the envelope might do. But you can codify that dimensionally as well.
Nori, could one possibility for that be something you and I were talking about offline, was that you could say, a certain percentage of your house can be a second story, and the second story of all homes, if your front setback is 15 feet, all second stories have to be set back 20 feet. So that like it's an additional 5 feet. So is that what you're talking about, like using words to essentially create that bulk plane, more or less?
Yeah, exactly. And so I think we should look at that alternative as we evaluate this. It is not a foregone conclusion that the bulk plane is the way to go, but it is generally it offers what we think is a little bit more flexibility than just those prescriptive standards, but it could work, and it merits looking at.
Melanie hasn't gotten a chance yet. Melanie, do you have any questions, thoughts? Is your mic on? I don't know.
I tried it, but it didn't want to go. Oh, there it goes. Thank you. Maybe I tried it like 2 or 3 times and it didn't go on. All I have to say is I just don't know right now. I just really don't know. I'd have to see, Nori, some models, or I'm extremely visual, so I mean, I want to see really what this is going to do. When somebody comes in with plans, I want to see what that is going to look like, you know, in a model, and not just kind of guess and go off the top of my head about what we're really going to land up with. And I just really don't know about the two of them. I mean, I think that the bulk plane seems to address a lot of our concerns about building form and massing away from the street, et cetera. But I'd like to really see how it would come down to lay people like me, how it really is going to, you know, transpire and give us what we want, or show us the options. Maybe bulk plane isn't the way to go. I just don't know that yet. Just from even this was a great presentation, Nori, but it doesn't. I think that it really has to gel for me more to really say, I think this is a great idea. We should do this for the R1, but we don't necessarily need to do it for downtown.
Right, and that, I appreciate that, and that's why intentionally we're not at the stage of asking you, do you think this is the way to go? We're asking, what are the questions you want answered? And so I'm hearing clearly you want to see what it might look like.
Right.
It's almost like they're both saying this on my left and right, and I think it has to do almost with, maybe another way to phrase it, tell me if this is right, Melanie, is like worst case scenario. What could happen if we, under different envelopes that we might actually think, or that Nora, you might think, might be appropriate to Carmel, typical 40 by 100 lot. Like, okay, if we do this type of envelope, what could happen? What could be the worst type of building we could see? What could be, and maybe visualize it, yes?
Yeah, and even compare, like, what volumetrics would look like given the plans that have come in, and what would the bulk plane look like?
Maybe even an illustration of what Brandon said, which I thought was so compelling, this idea that somehow folks have worked out the math to get the thing that will go through strictly by the numbers, and now we see this thing showing up, this thing, over and over again, is what he's saying, something I would not have known. So I think that kind of insight, what is that thing? Maybe you could show it to us.
Yeah, what is showing up?
What is showing up? How is volumetrics doing that to our town? Just to explain it to us, that would be great. As we bring this presentation into, like, away from the sort of general examples into our own town. I have a number of questions, probably more than everyone else, it sounds like. So can I pose them, but I don't? Yes? Okay.
Do you want to say something more?
Go ahead, Mary.
Just there's a couple houses that are perfect examples of that. One is, you know, the 2 blocks over on that corner next to the historic home, a modern one that went in, and then one was in the one that came up as one of the bad modern examples that do that. So, you know, you just carve, basically, you don't think about architecture, you just think about volume. So when you need some more room upstairs, you just take a chunk out downstairs and put it on upstairs. You know, you see these cubes that are shoved into each other, and wherever you need a little bit more square footage, you have a bump, and then you need to take something out on the bottom. You just recess the door a little bit so that you can have the chunk upstairs. That's literally what's happening, yeah.
Mary Ann's totally. I mean, it's really because it's a mathematical equation. It's a number shuffle. You're moving volume as a number around in space, and it does go up and it comes out. And I mean, I don't know if we could do it. I'm sure if anybody can, it's Nori. I'll talk to him about it. But like, if we just take a couple of those examples, like the one that Mary Ann was just talking about, and we put one of the basic bulk plane models that Nori was just talking about. It's really simple. square, cubular first level. What was the word you made up, Marianne?
Cubature.
Cubature. The lower level has a regular sort of like square cubature, and the second level does have a bevel on all the edges. I think you would see with that house that the front corner would just be like shooting out into the sky, and that's what we would gain. Or either by doing it with words like we were talking about, like saying second stories have to be set back farther than the first story, or by using some sort of shape that we put on there. So maybe, Nori, I don't know, is that something you guys can do? Is that easy?
It's not easy.
Okay, yeah.
But yeah, with your help,
Okay.
because again, there's so many variables.
Yeah.
But we do need to. We need to be.
I think so.
We need to drop some models in.
Okay.
I mean, as we.
You could
put
do one
forth.
extreme,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is what our fellow here in the audience, Jason, also wrote to us about today, is we all need help visualizing, not just those of us who might have an easier time of it, but everybody. So, and this is a public process, so that would be terrific. Don, go
Where is
ahead.
this house? It seems to be the classic example of what we don't want. Where is that?
Pardon me?
Where is
that
it? He's
house?
asking you where the house is
I'd
you're
like to go
referring
look at
to.
it.
Is it?
It's the corner of 9th and Monteverde.
Ninth
Yeah.
and Monteverde.
Thank you. Yeah.
Which corner?
Ninth of what?
You'll know it when you see it, but northeast corner of
Yeah.
9th and
Northeast
Monteverde.
corner, Yep.
Yeah.
Wow, you guys
So
are good.
You'll notice that you don't have to look for it.
No.
It'll hit you in the.
And I just, just for the sake of the fact this is a public meeting, we're not throwing any shade on the architect that did that house or the homeowner or anything. It was approved through the city process. None of it was illegal, but we're just, talking about things. I just want to.
Yeah, well, just talking about the visual.
Sure,
impact
absolutely,
and
absolutely.
context of
We're
the
not picking on
neighborhood.
anybody.
No,
Yeah.
of course not.
Okay.
Okay, let me ask you my questions, Nori and Brandon. First of all, I found the shapes of well, let me start one back. I knew as soon as you used the word building envelope, I finally knew what you were talking about all this time with bulk plane. I have never heard the term bulk plane. I mean, I've heard it, but I've never known what it was. I find the word buildable envelope
Better.
to be much more English language. And since one of our big projects from the last couple of weeks was friendliness and accessibility, I feel like even the word buildable is so nice. The buildable envelope. How far can you build up? So that is a suggestion, maybe more than a question.
Yeah, and I think that would be a good. I would suggest we add on 3D building envelope, because building envelope in the terms of like development world actually means something on a piece of paper. It's a
Buildable, though.
two-dimensional.
Yes, okay.
It's two-dimensional shape.
3D buildable
3D buildable envelope. Yeah.
Buildable. I love the word buildable.
Yep.
So, that said, when I look at the buildable envelopes that you presented, Nori, in your general examples, they're very suggestible shapes. They look like houses. They look like, some of them look like gable-ended, traditional, large, like a barn. Some of them look, obviously, they have the tilted gables. So I wonder if, this is a question like professional advice from you, Nori, and Brandon, how do you encourage variety and responsiveness to context? Maybe it's just the answer is the guidelines, which already encourage that so well, the design guidelines, and not have people immediately come with a visual like, oh, they want a barn, they want a long barn, I see what they want. Or maybe the architect or the designer or the homeowner says, oh, maybe if I know I can't fill the whole thing, but I'll just fill a third of the barn, and I'll propose a third of the barn, since that's the FAR. How do you fight, maybe it's just a graphic matter,
I
like
think you have a really valid
the
point
graphics
there.
have to be very fuzzy or something. What do you think, Nori, about that problem? Or maybe it's not a problem, I'm inventing a problem.
Well, no, it is, and that's why, in some cases, doing something like this, showing a range of forms to underscore that point. And the other part about it is the thing I stated very early on is it's very important that we have the correct balance between the maximum floor area that is permitted and the building envelope. because you were right. If the buildable envelope is the same as the square footage, you're going to get the barns. But if the square footage is less than that, which is the case pretty much already in Carmel, then you will have room for the guidelines to kick in to talk about the other variables that are important for compatibility.
So I guess I'm just raising that issue and saying, can we just look at that graphically as we go forward, if we go forward with this? And then a related question is something that's come up in the public discourse over these many months is the frustration many people have, and maybe it relates to Brandon's repeating volumetric equation, I'm not sure, but there's a recurring problem in the town with false or wimpy setback, wimpy variations in the volumes. So in your original design guidelines, Nori, it's super clear, these simple traditional volumes. Often your sketches show a traditional set of simple volumes.
Right.
But what we've seen a little bit, I don't know why, is a proliferation of like, oh, they want another volume, they want it to look a little bit of variety, so I'll punch something out 2 feet.
Right.
And that's like representing a room, but no room really is indicated by that 1 or 2 foot offset. So when I picture that barn shape, I'll just call it that for now, I think, oh gosh, maybe I could imagine like kind of making a bunch of like a ziggurat, a sort of bunch of setbacks and little moves that are not your original intention. How do we avoid that? Is there a way? Again, maybe it's just the guidelines.
I think that is in the guidelines, and you've raised that before, and we already in the drafts that we're working on are hitting that head on.
Okay.
In the old guidelines, there was one yes and no sketch, and that was it. And it talked about not being overly busy with those wall variations, but we're really now adding much more discussion about those modules, if you will, appearing to be authentic and believable occupied spaces.
Occupied, yeah.
May I have one suggestion for that?
Marianne has
Because I think that having these transparent 3D envelopes is a really good idea with something inside, but I think the something inside should be of very high quality then. So maybe a suggestion is to then take either historic or another actual house that exists in the town that universally people say this is a very good example, and put that into that box rather than, some theoretical shuffle.
Agree.
So
That'd be great.
And I'm
getting
sorry.
nods all
Good
around. So a
idea.
beloved historic
Yeah.
cottage would be within the.
Within the bulk
Yes,
plan.
lovely.
So, and I'm
It looks
sorry
like
to take
she's
public
moving.
time, but you won't see me live for a while. So I want to give everybody a hug. Merry
Aw,
Christmas.
Happy holiday.
Merry Christmas, and have good travels and keep well.
Thank you, Marianne, for all your hard work. Have a great day.
Merry Christmas.
Bye, Marianne. Oh, that's sad. We're sad to lose you, Marianne.
Thank you, sweetie.
Okay, we still have a quorum, though. Thank heavens. It's such an interesting discussion. Okay, so that's a great suggestion. So there was another question you asked, Nori, about how many envelopes. And I want to throw out the idea, the question of, we have 3 things that are, this is the residential now only. We have 3 things that are kind of discrete in already that are allowable. One is the garage, one is the house, and now is the ADU. Maybe that, and then this is a question for Brandon, if you put together an ADU envelope, do the states say, sorry, nice try, envelopes don't count for ADUs?
So we're working on a draft right now to our ADU ordinance, and there is a line where the ADU becomes a certain size that you can do that. I would say for this exercise, let's leave ADUs off the table because it's going to make it overly complicated. Let's just maybe stick to the garage and the house.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it sounds like Brandon is saying that, to answer Nori's question, the idea of 2 envelopes, 2 buildable envelopes, is a possible variation or a possible version of this. Is that what you're saying, Brandon?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'll defer to Nori. He's by far the expert on this concept more than I am, but it seems like you could, if you wanted to treat a garage, which we see a lot detached garages in here, that's just a look that we like here. If you wanted to have a separate 3D building envelope for your garage, you could do that, right, Nori?
You could. You could.
Should you do that?
Yes.
In your opinion?
Well, I'm not sure we need to. I'm thinking we may want to have a lower one-story portion in front for a certain distance, which could be a lower portion of the main house or a garage. But it's worth looking at.
Well, the reason I'm not sure it would work to do that is that we actually allow the garage to move out of the setback, as you know.
Right.
And so
move into the setback.
Sorry, that's what I meant.
Yeah.
To encroach, yeah.
Right, encroach. And the rest of the building will never be allowed to encroach in that way. So when something moves forward into the encroachment, I think it probably needs to be governed by something.
Well, again, and I don't know yet, because these are all great questions, and we haven't, of course, really gotten into considering them yet. But is it possible that that becomes one of these things, is that garage that is permitted to encroach, because it's a special condition that is not a by right condition, that we don't adjust the envelope, we just say, yes, that can extend past it. But it has its guidelines in terms of it has to be in scale, has to be in character, etc.
We have a lot of limitations on that right now, 15-foot height limit, so many square feet. So they're pretty limited as it is. And I mean, not to tip our hand too much, but we are looking at, the appropriateness of so many garages being permitted in the front setback. There's been a lot lately. Originally, it was intended to create variation on the streets. Some have made the argument that variation exists, and we maybe don't need any more of that variation.
Isn't the other intention, though, and this leads to a follow-up question, to reduce the appearance of bulk of the main house by taking the garage, the floor area that's devoted to cars and not humans, and separating it out, because some people are okay with walking from the garage to the house, you reduce the apparent size of the house. So this is why I'm asking, if you had, what Nori just suggested is, well, you could have an exception where this buildable envelope stays, and then something else could be asked for in the front. But my instinct is that you would want a different buildable envelope for folks who separate out their garage, because one of the reasons for that separate garage is to reduce the the appearance of the back building.
Yeah. I guess I don't have, and it may well be that it needs to be a separate envelope, which is fine. But I guess I don't have here actually an example of an envelope that, well, this kind of, but this is too extreme. Let me see. But imagine that this portion is only, say, the depth of a garage. And then but that could be occupied space or a garage. And then the rest of the envelope gets bigger behind it. That's one form that we could look at. But your point may be very valid, that it is cleaner and simpler to have a distinct separate garage envelope. So it's worth looking at. Some of these dealt with that, and when in these contexts, the garage was in the rear, and therefore there was I'm trying to find one that really shows that well. But in any case, it steps down in the back here, imagine flipping that. And that's in the forward element in some way. So
and that would be in the setback. So.
In the setback, yes.
And my question to the group, I guess, is wouldn't that then affect the main buildable envelope? I think we might want it to, I guess, because you wouldn't want somebody to be able to have a full buildable envelope in the rear and then also get the part that's in the encroachment. I don't know. I throw that out there.
Good question.
Yeah, we'll look at that. I think it's a good thing for us to explore more. This is what we're getting at, is asking, what questions need to be asked, like
Yes.
Nori said. So this is one that we can look at.
And the ADU thing, just really quick to follow up on that, Brandon, you're saying that it is not, it's too complex. I just want to make sure, I just want to ask, and maybe you can tell us later, what the timing of that is, because I don't want to lose Nori if there is a chance of some help and
Yeah,
regulation.
we won't lose him.
Okay.
I plan on
For the
having a
ADU
draft
thing.
in like February to the Planning Commission.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then now to the commercial thing, and then I think I'm kind of through my main questions. The exercise we did at the public workshop, it was phrased as stories. The buildable envelope looks to me like it's shown as numbers, meaning heights. Nori, I wanted to thank you for those beautiful historic examples of the bigger buildings that we have downtown, and you probably won't be able to find it easily, but there was one that you showed. It's also, most of them you showed were Mediterranean style. There was one that had a very beautiful, maybe it was octagonal tower in the interior of the block that looked to me, and again, who knows, I can't tell from the photo really, possibly to be higher than the allowable street face. And then of course you showed auberge, which not only is 3 stories, but has the appearance of 3 stories. It's probably grandfathered in. Yeah, oh, there you have it. Okay, we see the tower kind of from this street angle being very recessive, very modest, and I think very beautiful as a feature of the block, but has really no effect on the streetscape, the tower in the back. So one of the things,
You mean the Cypress Inn?
Yeah.
This is a Cypress Inn, yeah, but you said, yeah, auberge.
Oh, yeah, I was also talking about auberge
Yeah,
separately.
okay.
Yeah, but this is the Cypress Tower.
It just got a weird segue, dear.
Sorry. So the question is, can we use buildable envelopes to handle, and I don't disagree that the commercial district is much simpler in many ways with this 0 lot line condition everywhere and a certain very obvious rules about 30 feet at the street. But there are lovely features, and maybe this has to do with things kind of like the chimney example you gave, Nori, before, but I think this would be on a larger scale, where the interior of commercial blocks with their larger buildings often, and their larger volume as buildings, could have things in the center of the block that the buildable envelope or bulk plane technique or tool could address, like this tower or something like it. So I just throw that out there, and I don't know if you have the Cypress Inn image too, just to remind us all. So it could be a very general, almost universal buildable envelope for downtown that just simply visually states the 30-foot height allowability of the street, and then maybe talks about the interior of the block a little bit.
I mean, it certainly is something that can be addressed in a form standard of some type that goes beyond the project in terms of the maximum height that's permitted right now. So we'd have to figure out how to discuss it without opening up that change as a part of the guidelines project in terms of the overall height. But there certainly are precedents for it here.
It would be a shame in my mind to do anything that would discourage some of the most beautiful buildings that we already have, that have a kind of grandeur to them and a coherence to them. So I just throw that out there because a lot of those buildings actually have what I think we would now be a little bit afraid of, which is a fairly vertical front plane at the street. They define the street very sort of firmly. But there's a lot of articulation, as you said, Nori.
That might be another, Madam Chair, if I could, I think that might be another tick in the box for Mary Ann's point of perhaps we don't need the bulk plane in the downtown area. Perhaps it is more of a residential tool, and we use our written guidelines in the downtown area.
Well, I am liking, and this will push back just slightly, I am liking the introduction of the notion, if what my colleagues have said bears out, that when we look at worst case scenarios, we're comfortable. What I like about buildable envelope is that it's visual. And even if it's a super simple, almost universal thing, I think if the town, the citizenry, the developers, et cetera, the residents get used to this concept of a buildable envelope, I wouldn't want to say, oh, you don't have to think about buildable envelope when you cross this street. I think it's a tool. I'm feeling optimistic. I'm waiting for Dawn and Melanie's proof that they've asked for, but I'm feeling optimistic about it as a tool. And I would like it to be part of our vocabulary, I guess. So I hate to say, oh, no, wait, you cross, which district am I in? Oh, I don't need to think that way, that kind of thing. Yeah. So I throw that out there as a plug, even if it's a very simple version, to make it a tool that feels like it's part of the city if we adopt it.
Okay.
So that is, I think that was pretty much it, except to say that Nora, you brought up all these beautiful exceptions. You called it tailoring. You tailor for things like solar access. You tailor for hills. You tailor for narrow lots, odd-shaped lots. You tailor, as Mary Ann pointed out, for the historical sites. And man, I just think that's a very good question. How much tailoring would we be doing here? Nori, do you feel like, what's your instinct about it? Like, there's a lot of things we would have to tailor to. Mary Ann's she felt strongly about it, and I think is a very good one. I think my colleagues all agreed with that. They nodded vigorously. But solar access, hills, things like that, what do you think? And Brandon, what do you think of the two, of how much tailoring, especially for the variety of the residential area?
I think just enough is the answer. We want to keep it simple, but on the other hand, we don't want it to be a club that it's doesn't provide for the sensitivity to context that we need. Now, fortunately, we have it in combination with guidelines and standards, so it doesn't have to do everything. And that's why, I appreciate your argument, and even though the envelope may be simple for the commercial core, it's still there for people to understand. So I think we want to consider those variables, how many actually get applied or are part of the basic envelope, or are exceptions or provisions for those unique situations. We'll want to watch that very carefully.
One of the things that Nori and I talked about that may kind of like further his point that he just made is that when we know that there's situations that exist a lot in town, like historic buildings, we have a lot of historic buildings, or having an uphill and a downhill side of a street. Maybe you design tailored bulk planes for those situations that are repeatable all over the village. If you have a thing that's only like maybe once every few hundred houses or something like that, maybe you don't do it for that.
And then what do you do there? Do you just say, come to the Planning Commission or the staff first and then the Planning Commission, and we will talk about this as an exceptional circumstance?
Well, ideally those situations, that's kind of what Nori was saying, ideally those situations are the ones that are controlled by the guidelines. So the guidelines talk about things like bulk and mass still too. We're not just, it's not like we say no words about bulk and mass in the guidelines, but the bulk plane tool or the building envelope tool, or if we just go with a percentage or whatever, that's sort of the bigger philosophy and how we control it citywide.
Okay. So it's not always doing all the work. That's been made clear by Nori and Brandon now. Okay, let me pause and just ask my colleagues to my remaining colleagues to my left and right if they want to add anything before I take it out to the public again.
Not me.
Don?
No, I don't have any.
Okay, you can still talk later. Okay, I don't see any hands up on the Zoom room, but Neil, were you about to raise your hand? Yes, Neil, come on up. And then I see, oh no, okay.
Thank you, Neil Cruz. Yeah, I still like the bulk plane, you guys, because we haven't even talked about the fact that we might want to leave, we're talking that a second story should be pushed to the back. We can do that more with the bulk plane than we can with volumetrics.
Mhm.
So I think we can reshape where the massive building is coming up on our property. So it's an extra tool.
Mhm.
I like the fact that an architect doesn't have to go through a complicated calculation and they can just start work on it. There may be places where it does not work or it's complicated, but I think your discussion has pretty much handled that. You could roll out to the Planning Commission and say, hey, I want to break on this because of this and this, and there would be a way for the commission to say, your lot is exceptional and we'll allow you to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if there's any possible use of saying in one circumstance, well, on this property, they should use the volumetrics. I don't know if there's anything because of this site, it's unusual, whatever, this particular system should be used for that site. It's probably too complicated to do that. Nuri might know better about that kind of thing. On the commercial, we're talking 30 feet, and I tend to agree with Marianne that we can do that with words. And the one thing is, and this has been discussed, about pushing the upper portions of the building back from the front street, I think is a good idea. So maybe we don't want to make it so that they have to, but that if they do, they get a compensation in some way. Okay, so you're going to do a two-story building, maybe you can have 12 foot, 12 foot, 24 foot high, and you're going to push that upper floor back, and as a result, you get a higher roof or something like that. It then encourages stepping back, and you get a benefit for it, something like that. That's all I can think of for right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Our other attendant? No? Okay. And then in the Zoom room, I see Gabriel has his hand up. Gabriel?
Hello. So thinking about the commercial district and how that's been sort of the focus in terms of meeting RENA numbers, in the question of whether or not the volumetric method or a bulk plane method should be adopted, I guess it would be worth maybe just thinking about which one might accommodate a little bit more, volume in terms of what can fit in the spaces. And at a parcel level, I think it's one thing that makes more sense in the residential area, of course, but when it comes to these commercial areas where often you have buildings or facades that are virtually seamless in a certain way, there isn't as much distinction between one building and the next. It might be worth considering the idea that a bulk plane at a maybe even a block level to help the city distinguish, what do you want to see at the block level rather than specific parcel. Just because I think it seems to me from just an intuitive understanding of building envelopes and form-based code and its potential for allowing units. Again, I'm thinking mostly here about multifamily units because that's what the city needs to think about. Which one will allow for better use of existing space, zoning, and FAR. Just wanted to put that out there as something to consider going forward.
Thank you, Gabriel. I think that what Brandon, if I can paraphrase, was trying to react to with that earlier topic was that we have two different tools. You could end up with the same capacity for each tool. You could make the volumetric tool give you more capacity for living space, or you could make the bulk plane or the buildable envelope tool. It's not the choice of the tool that dictates how much space, it's other things. It's what you then do with the tool. Did I capture that right, Brandon? Yes, he's got his thumbs up. But I think it's, again, goes back to the kind of worst case, best case scenario examples that we might get down the line here as we get into it for Carmel. I don't see any other hands up, and I would like to have a few minutes at least to just go down the final rest of the agenda. But I think this has been fantastic. I don't know. I know, Nori, this is still just very general educational. I feel educated by it. Is it okay for everyone to leave this topic for now and wait for the more specific Carmel-related stuff at the next go-round? Okay, for everybody? Okay.
I think it's excellent that Nori has educated us on this.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nori.
It's a very
know
good
much more about it.
presentation, Nori. Thank you so much.
Nori, you're dismissed if you want to be, so you can go have a lozenge.
I do need to leave. Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Thanks, Nori. See you later.
Thank you
Happy
so much.
holidays.
Happy holidays. Thank you for everything.
Same to you too.
Okay. So we just have, that was item 4. Now we're on item 5, which is future agenda items, the last item of the day. As usual, Doug and I, unfortunately Doug couldn't be here, but we sort of tried to capture the sort of main events of the last 2 meetings, because it was one meeting actually, one continued meeting. So we have a draft, as you all know. That's what we did basically the entire time for those 2 meetings, is come up with a draft of some organizing principles. As I said before, they are now online. That doesn't mean anything about whether they're adopted or approved or we like them or don't like them. It's a working draft. But down to the upcoming agenda items, we we will at some point, Brandon, maybe probably after the holidays, we're gonna do a big, major, massive minutes backlog review at some point.
You're going to love it.
I'm sure it'll be riveting. There similarly, a sort of catch-up session from staff about just kind of sorts of things that we might not have gotten to see at public meetings yet, just a sort of rundown. We have now done a educational session about what we might be calling buildable envelope, but the bulk plane, and that, but it sounds like we need more on that, Brandon, so that's like TB, you know.
Yeah, we'll figure out, I mean, just one thing for the committee to bear in mind is that, you know, at the last meeting, I laid out the critical path items that Nori and I need to get to our goal of June next year. These additional items, you know, we're going to try to fit them in as we can, or when they dovetail with something that we're bringing. So I would see the next conversation potentially on the bulk plane or building envelope thing, maybe even when we start talking about the red lines of the design guidelines. So there's more to talk about. But yeah, absolutely, we're going to need more feedback on that one from you and the public as well. And we have sent on that line. I sent out an email. And I'm going to send out another one to basically any, you know, architect, builder, anybody in the industry that has submitted an application with us for the last several years, asking them to start to get involved, because we haven't seen a lot of folks from the industries. Sure. So hopefully we'll start to see them come out more.
That was good. I'm glad you did that. Yeah. That would be very helpful. And then I'm just running through this out loud so people can refresh their memories. We do need a session somehow, or at least an agenda item on new standards for man-made materials. That's come up a million times. Yes. Melanie brought up residential street side parking and the right-of-way and how that we haven't really focused on that. Someone else today brought up power lines. Again, that's really, I don't know what purview we have over that, but it is part of the right-of-way. So I'm just kind of parking it in my mind and on this note sheet here.
It impacts the landscape.
It sure does. It sure does. Existing building retention is not something, although again, we actually kind of touched on it a little bit with encouraging historic designation as a way to help you protect your property, actually. It's a very interesting idea. We didn't think we had any hope on that one, but now maybe we do.
And I will say Nori is working on a bigger, in kind of sort of response to the Carmel Preservation Association's requests and some of the conversations we have, that sort of, I think Carol Hall calls them like a tier 2 type of properties. We're going to have a discussion about that in the red lines of the design guidelines as well, because we are mentioning that there are properties that are important that maybe aren't listed as historic. So maybe there's a way to encourage, not dictating like with historic buildings, we can say you cannot do this, but maybe incentivizing versus dictating. So we'll have that conversation.
And also be interesting to know, I did read that tier 2 thing. Are there criteria that could be broader for Carmel? This is just following up on sort of channeling Mary Ann than for regional, state, or federal standards. So if somebody in Carmel, is there something particularly lovely about a particular property, even if it doesn't meet the state criteria or the federal criteria, maybe Carmel has a little broader criteria so that folks have that tool available to them. I don't know. Just a thought. So that's existing building. Retention is still on our topic. Compounds is something Doug has reminded us of many times. The landscape ordinance will be on a future agenda, of course, and then there's the downtown tree wells issue that came up recently. So this is what we've talked about so far. Does anyone have anything to add that they've thought about recently, or any comment on what this is so far as a kind of ongoing list?
That's a lot.
What's that?
We already have a lot.
It's a lot.
Yeah,
It's a
I was gonna make my pitch that unless there's something that's going to bomb this entire project and not make it feasible in June, I would say we've kind of got our work laid out for us now with this list. So unless something comes up, we're like, oh man, we didn't even
Right.
think about this. Let's
Exactly.
please add this conversation. I would ask kindly that we don't add much more to upcoming agenda
Of course,
items.
and to me, this all fits in what we've
Yeah,
been
I think
talking
so,
about
too.
for 8 or 9 months.
Right.
So if that's kind of the nature of this question, is there anyone that's thought of anything that we don't have on the running list? So far, so good.
I think so.
And any suggestions? I mean, again, you gave us the schedule last time, Brandon, but the very next thing is what in your mind when we get back?
Landscaping.
Landscape ordinance,
Yeah.
okay.
Okay.
All right.
Because if you recall, I'm going to be going to the city council in January or February, asking them to approve a contract with a landscaping architect. Yeah.
Okay. And we will or will not meet, do you think, before you have to do that? Or planning to do that?
Unknown. If I go
No,
in, if I
unknown.
go in January, we won't meet before, because the January meeting, I don't think we'll have time to meet before that. But if the selection of the landscape architect is someone that is something that I think this committee needs to weigh in on, I'm trying to say this diplomatically. If it's something we need feedback on, then I'll certainly come. Or maybe I won't go in January, I'll wait till February and then bring it.
Okay.
When will we
Yeah.
have that opportunity to weigh in on the consultant, landscape consultant?
It will either, well, so it's tricky timing. So if I go in January with a proposed, and they may say, this is who we like, but just go get feedback from the steering committee. But we got pretty clear direction from city council to bring it to them to make the decision. It's city council's decision. But if I can find time to bring it to this group before I go to city council, I will. So if we go in January, it might be tough. If we go in February, it shouldn't be a problem.
I think it would be nice if there's a way, even if it's a short Zoom or something,
Mhm.
if people are far flung, to be able to at least give a recommendation. Even if, obviously, it's not our decision, et cetera. But, you and I and Doug, the chair and vice chair, can talk it over
Yeah.
offline. Okay, so it is very close to 4:30. I don't know if there's any final comments from the public. Our live public has left the building. I don't know if there's anyone in the Zoom room that would like to have any final thoughts aired. I don't see any hands up. Okay, so then I will say we are on our way to peace on earth here in Carmel through the progress we are making on reducing conflict and increasing friendly access to this document, yeah? Okay, happy holidays, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you very much for all your hard work. And Brandon, thank you very much, and have a happy holiday.
Yes,
Wonderful, healthy holiday.
yes.
You and the
Yes.
family.
Let's keep our masks on. Yeah, I know.